Hi there guys, welcome back to my studio. My name's Conor and I am a wildlife artist that specialises in both Scratchboard and graphite. So welcome into the second part of this three-part series on how to create a red panda in Scratchboard. So as you've just seen in part one, we looked at the eyes, the nose and the muzzle. So in this second part, we're going to focus on this little bit more complicated texture, this really dense fur that makes up the head and the ears of this red panda. So I hope you guys enjoy this one and let's get started. Right then guys, so we're going to start making a start on this guy's head really. So looking at our reference photo, there's the shape of the head, so it comes up and around and over this side, and I can just about see, you can see my sort of line art reference points. So I'm going to start about here on this outside edge, and what I'm going to do is I'm just sort of layering in those initial bits of fur, and these are just going to help guide me and help me see the sort of direction that I'm putting these sort of fur strands in. Now obviously in part one we covered sort of how to do most of this guy's face. I'm hoping now in part two we'll manage to sort of bring a lot of this head area together, and you can see a little bit more about how I tackle this fur, which is a little bit of a different type of fur when we compare it to what was on the face. The face was a lot shorter, whereas this is a lot more sort of crazy and a bit wavy and a bit scraggly. So looking at our reference photo, you can see the fur ends up angling off as it sort of heads behind the head. So we've got a fair few changes already. So it starts off this way, and then as it goes round, it almost fans out. So these are little things that you're going to want to try and pick up from the reference photo. Now I'm not worrying too much yet about the tone. I'm just getting this base layer in. The sort of darkest tone is going to be just around here where this area of fur in front overlaps it. So as long as I don't go too bright there, then we should be fine. Now even though this fur's a little bit more wavy, it's still quite short in theory. It's not sort of like the long fur you'd expect on, for example, like a lion's mane or the sort of jowls of a tiger sort of region. It's still relatively short. Now I'm trying to, on these initial base layers, just add in this waviness to it. So none of these fur strokes are perfectly straight. They've all got a little bit of a curvature to them. So I'll try and do it a bit slower just so you can see. So I'm doing one. Now I'm trying not to be deliberate with these strokes. I find if I'm deliberate and I'm really trying to concentrate on putting them in exactly, then I find they go a bit too bright and a bit too rigid. So I almost, especially for these underlays of fur, just go a bit looser and just let my hand do what it wants, as long as they're going in roughly the right fur direction. So I'm not going to come too far across just yet. Now I did put in a little bit of a marker just here where it transitions from this sort of medium toned fur to this area of brighter white fur, and then just in between the two there's a bit of a band of darker fur. So these are all things that you're going to want to, like I say, try and pay attention to in the reference photo. And the more you look at the reference photo, the more little subtleties like these you'll see. And that's not just, let's say on this reference photo, just as you do more drawings and as you look at more reference photos, you'll see little subtle things that do help. Now here on this whole area so far, we've been using this 5M1 tattoo needle. So as I said in the last video, this is it's not a specific brand, but there's 3 tattoo needles you can just about see there, and then there's 2 tattoo needles sat on top, so it's like a bit of a weaved pattern. And I'm just using that because every time I put a mark down, it doesn't just leave 1 mark, it will leave 2, 3, sometimes even 4 marks, which is great for doing this under fur. Now I said in part 1 about the 3 things that I tend to look for when I'm doing fur, or the 3 things that I'm trying to get right: fur length, fur direction and fur tone. So like I say, obviously at the minute we're not worrying as much about fur tone because these are just your initial base layers. We have thought about it because we know there's this stripe of sort of darker fur coming down here. I say darker fur, it's just a lower mid-tone. But fur direction and fur length are really playing important roles at the minute. Now I'm not going to come down onto this area of brightness, I'm just going to keep it on the top part of this head. Now I'm going to try and just use my 1 RL tattoo needle. So this is just a single pointed tattoo needle just on its own, and I might just see how this reacts if I just pull up some of these fur strands. I'm trying to work out, is this going to go bright enough for any of the other layers? Now it's really good for creating fur or thin fur, but because it's only 1 needle, it's got a lot of flex to it, so it won't leave a very bright mark. So that means that we can't go particularly bright with it, which is fine. We can use it for other things. It's not essential we use it, it's just one of my go-to tools. So I'm going to use this, my craft knife, for this one. Now any craft knife will do. I'm using a Swan Morton for this one, but just a simple craft knife from a local hobby store will work fine. And just around the edge of this fur, it's just catching the light, and that's what we want to try and capture. So you can see my fur strokes are quite random. And what you don't want, so see at the minute how we've got this sharp line between this area of bright fur and this area of mid-tone, that's not something that you want. So I'll show you just here how to get rid of it, but what I normally do is I get the whole area in and then I worry about smoothing this out. But once it's there, you just want to pull down a few more strokes and almost soften this edge. And just like that, it's a little bit softer. But but that's what you want to do. You don't want this harsh edge showing the area where you go from light fur to dark fur on this section anyway. There will be areas on pieces where you want that, but not on this one. Just going to continue over to this side, so I know where the edge of this ear is, so it comes down there. So I just want to know where I'm working really. So you can see how sharply this fur sort of angles off, and it will eventually sort of come round into the back. Now, I talked about in the first part how we can also use this tattoo needle just to give us a bit more dense looking fur. So feel free if you want to use that in some places, or if you want to use your craft knife, then that's fine as well. So what I'm probably going to do now is just start to work down and add in some more of these base layers. So you've already seen how I would do it around this side, and I've also shown you quite a lot in section 1. So I'm just going to start working on these areas and just try and build up this under fur a little bit quicker. So I'll speed up this area, and then I'll come back to you when we're adding those highlights. Okay, so a lot of the base layers of fur have now been sort of put in. Obviously we've got a little bit of a line here that we need to adjust and add a little bit more tone or variation to this area. So because of where it is, I'm actually just going to flip my board upside down now. Now the reason for that is because I find it a lot easier to pull the fur strands towards me instead of sort of trying to push them away. So if I show you, when I'm looking to create a fur texture, I'm pulling towards me rather than trying to push away. And I could work sort of from the top down and pull towards me, but I always just find I prefer to flick the fur on the very end, which gives a bit of a tapered look, and I find it easier and quicker just to do that when I'm pulling towards myself. So we're just going to re-establish this top edge and add a little bit more tone into here. So we're just going to brighten this edge where it's just capturing the sun. And again, I'm just flicking out these strokes, pulling out a few extra ones, just as a few little flyaway hairs, just to add a bit more interest. Now this area as well that we added in is quite bright as well, and it does then transition into this top area. Now we only added one layer of fur to this area just because most of it I'm probably going to look to achieve with my craft knife, just because it's very wiry and wavy in places, so I want to try and capture that. Now it will take longer because I'm doing it with just the craft knife, but that's okay. Right then. So now another area that we put in was this sort of ridge line along here. Now the idea is I'm just going to pull some of these fur strands up and over, and it will look to soften out that line and make it less harsh. I may have to go back in and just sort of lighten the line up a little bit if it's still a little bit too dark, but I want there to be this transition between this really bright fur along the edge, and just for the shape of the head there needs to be a little bit of a divot here. I think I mentioned in part 1, with this craft knife there's actually two sides to it. So you've got this side that I'm working on now, where the blade sort of faces into the board, and this gives like a medium highlight. It's not the brightest highlight, but it is up there. And then the other side, if I turn it and face it this way, will give me a much brighter highlight. So for example, around this edge, which is where the brightness is going to need to be, you can already see how that area is much brighter than these two areas here. Now I'm quite selective on where I use this because it will make the area incredibly bright, so I don't want to use it in too many places, or only in the areas that really need that bright highlight. So here the fur will eventually transition into the ear, so we'll get a bit of a softer line, so I'm not too worried about this area down here. Like I say, as I do the ear, that fur will soften and sort of blend into that area. So you can even see now, just with that extra little bit of detailing, it's just added a bit more interest, and it has just softened up that line if we compare here to sort of there. Now I tried to leave in some of the areas that I just wanted to look a bit more clumped together, so I'm trying to just preserve them. And as we work over this area, I'll end up needing to rotate my board again. So don't be afraid if you feel like you need to rotate your board. You don't have to keep it in the exact same position all of the time. I try and keep mine, when I'm filming, in relatively the same position, just so that you're not having to watch me rotate it every couple of minutes. But if I was working on this piece and I wasn't filming, I'd be rotating it a lot more than what I do. So again, we're still now paying attention to the fur direction, the fur length, but we're giving a little bit more consideration to the tone of the fur. And what I'm also looking at is the gaps between the fur. So can I see much of the shadow between the fur on the reference photo? If I can, I'll try and space my marks out a little bit more like this. If I can't, I'll space them out like this, where it's a bit brighter. So as a general rule, the brighter the area is, the less, or the denser the area is, the less shadow you'll see between the fur strokes, and they'll almost be in more clumps. So I'm not aiming for hyper realism. I'm not trying to get every single fur stroke in the exact right position when I compare it to the reference photo. And I know I say this a lot, but sometimes I think we can get bogged down with trying to get every single clump of fur in the right direction and the right place. But I think if this red panda was, you know, if the photo was taken a couple of seconds later, he would have been looking a lot different. So a lot of the time it's just about trying to get a feel for what it is you're drawing, and if there's the general tones are right and the fur direction and the fur length, then it's going to give you a realistic picture. It's not going to look too far wrong. And not many people, unless you're a pet portrait artist and you know doing people's pets and animals, no one's going to really hold up the reference photo and say, well, you didn't get that clump of fur in the right place, or there was another bit of fur sticking out there. So don't worry too much. This is your artwork at the end of the day. So it's not, you know, if you don't want to achieve, if you don't want to get everything in that right place, and then that's absolutely fine, because I don't. You know, I'm not looking and saying, well, this part that I'm working on here, I need one bit of fur going there and then I need another one doing that. I'm just getting that general feel, and hopefully at the end it'll look like a red panda. So I'm going to go in with my brighter highlight now. But I'm just going to be a little bit more careful. Now this fur at the top's a bit more dense, so I may just go back in with my tattoo needle and just try and take out some of that space between my fur strokes. And then again, I'm just blending it down because I don't want that harsh line. So we still need to come around this edge with some of these bright highlights. Now I'm not going to worry too much about this area down here, I'm going to work on that as I come down and around, but I am just going to rotate my board again, because like I say, these are key areas that I want to focus on and I want to get in the right place. I have to turn my reference photo as well, don't forget to do that. So let's start here. I'll just pull out some of these. I'm just working out the shapes of what I'm doing at the minute. I'm not fully committing like I did around the top. And what I might do, let's try bringing out the 1RL tattoo needle. So this is going to allow me to just work into these areas a little bit more delicately. Because there's a few sort of clumps of fur in this area. Again, I'm not trying to get all of these in the exact right place. I'm almost just winging it almost. So I just want that feel. I'll never get all of those clumps in the exact right position, although is that right place. So I'm just doing what I think will look okay. But if you want to spend time trying to work out exactly where these clumps are, again, absolutely fine. But I'm happy just to go for that general feel. This brightness needs to now be worked down into this area. So now I've got a couple of these sort of clumps mapped out. I'll just add some highlighted strands to the end and a few little wavy furs coming out. Now the edges around here I'm not going to work into just yet, because what I'll look to do is when I'm working on the ear, I'll work back into these areas. At the minute we're just concentrating on this forehead. So it's always a bit difficult to tell what your piece looks like when you're looking at it like this from the side. So now I've got most of that fur direction in, we'll pop it back to its original position, just so you guys can see it. And I'm now just judging what areas need brightening for this specific area. So I think it all needs brightening, to be honest. So let's work to bring this down. So before this I was looking at my reference photo with my line art superimposed onto the top of it. Now that line art, to be superimposed, it makes the photo underneath a little bit brighter, a little bit fainter, like more transparent. So you have to be careful you're not judging your tones wrong. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start working over this forehead again and just boosting up those highlights and that contrast. Okay, so now that we've sort of built up the highlights and sort of smoothed out some of these transitions a little bit, I think what's next is we're going to start working on this side of the face, maybe a little bit on this side as well, but just sort of try and bring this down. I feel like we need some of these darker tones in a little bit more to help us, and then after that I think we'll move on to the ears. But for now I think let's tackle this area just here. As you can see with the W, and then we've got this black stripe there, and we'll just bring this down a little bit further. Right then, so to tackle this area just down here, we're going to do the exact same as what we've been doing for the rest of the fur. So there's no sort of new techniques being introduced here. We're just going to use our 5M1 tattoo needle and just start with those base layers. Now I'm working from the outer edge in, so I'm just sort of outlining where this sort of edge of the white stripe's going to be, because it does sort of merge over into just this sort of head fur that comes down. So the actual bright white of the fur we have sort of marked out with our line art at the beginning, but we're just putting in a few marks so that we know where they're going to be. And then there's this sort of tuft of fur just up here. So we want to make sure when we're looking at the reference photo we're comparing sort of two levels of brightness. So we've got obviously the area around the muzzle, and then we've also got this area that we're working on now, and they look roughly the same level of brightness. that's what we're trying to achieve. Now, we're not going to get this brightness exactly to the level we want just yet. There's still a lot more layers that we need to put in, both on the sort of face and the muzzle, above the eyes, and just on the top of the ears. But we're going to do that just in a little bit once we've got a few other areas in. So this area down at the bottom, it ends up sort of overlapping into this area of darkness as well. So just slowly trying to work out where we're going to be with this piece at that area. I think it's a bit clearer to see here how sort of random my strokes are being. I'm not keeping everything nice and uniform. I'm making sure that we're having a bit of variety in these strokes. So you can kind of see just on the video how they're crossing over into each other. They're not running parallel to each other, and that's quite a key thing. We want this red panda to look a little bit scruffy. The fur's not perfectly straight, and even on these initial base layers, that's what we're looking to do. What I might also start doing, just so I've got the outline of everything, I just want to get in a few little strokes for this sort of, it's almost going to be where it transitions onto the body, because these are going to be quite important later on. We want to make sure that we know where this black area is, because we do want to put a little bit of fur texture in there. We don't want to put a lot in there because I don't want it to take away from that sort of darkness, but I also don't want to get confused and go sort of too far over. So just putting this little edge of that back piece of fur in will sort of just help me define the two areas, especially when I start coming up and around on this area of the head, just to try and join it all together. Now feel free, if you are following along, to rotate your board at this stage. Like I say, it's always a little bit difficult when I'm filming because I don't want to keep rotating my board as I normally would, because it's hard to sort of keep setting up the camera to focus and sort of look consistent. So I try and keep it in the same place, but obviously if it is your own piece, feel free to move things around. It's going to be easier to, at this point, to have the board sort of rotated on its side and just be working down. But for this, I'm just having to sort of twist my arm slightly. but you want to try and always be in the most comfortable position when doing this fur. So that's that initial base layer done there. This sort of head area will come down and around, but this area here is quite bright, so I'm going to build up the brightness in this area first, and then I'm going to work on those surrounding areas of darkness, or of sort of mid-tone, and join the two areas together. So what I'll probably do, this is going to take a little bit of time again, I'll speed it up slightly just to get this area here in, and then when we come back and start working on these other areas, I'll come back. Right, so you can see that in the end I ended up rotating the board anyway. We've still got a lot of work to do with fur going in this direction, and it was starting to hurt my shoulder, so I thought we'd best just rotate it now. So I've put that second layer of fur in. Now you can see that there's quite a lot of black lines still showing through, quite similar to what we've got up here. But on the reference photos, when we're having a look at that, it's quite denser looking fur. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to either my 5M1 tattoo needle and just put another layer over it. It's particularly more dense as it's sort of coming up to this black area of fur. So I'm just going to put a little bit more. Now this will help because it will only knock the brightness back slightly, so we'll have to go back over that, but it will definitely help make the fur look more dense without making it look wiry. So if I was to go back over and sort of try and make this more dense with just my craft knife, it runs the risk of it looking a bit, like I say, wiry, a bit too, because you can only put down one strand at a time, it just gives this almost artificial look that I don't like. So I will go back over like this, and then that way the fur that's sort of coming down here now just looks a bit more dense. And then we'll end up going back over this with our craft knife just to brighten it up. But that's a much quicker way of sort of building that density. So now when we go back over, we'll just boost this brightness. And instantly you can see on the video how this area is brighter than, let's say, this area. So it's really important to come back in and sort of boost that contrast back up. And you'll have to do this quite a lot throughout the piece because, as I've said before, as you start adding in different areas of brightness, it will start adjusting how the other areas look. And also as we start sort of scratching the dust and the ink off this board, the dust is going to start settling into some of the other areas, and that can also adjust that sort of level of brightness. So I'm just going to start getting in this other area of fur. Now here I'm using my just one round liner tattoo needle, and that's just because I want some quite precision marks. And these are really quite good because you can get some really fine marks, and then if you press a bit harder you do get quite a lot of variety, but it allows you to really keep those marks faint if you really want them to. Now this area up here actually starts blending over, and so does this area down here. This little tattoo needle is really good if you just want those fine little lines, little tiny strands of fur just poking out over into other areas. It works really well. Now we'll come back over this area with my craft knife as well, just to really refine those. But we're trying to now start joining all these different areas up together, so we're sort of ending up completing more of this face. Okay, so back to our 5M1. Going to rotate my reference photo. So when you, there we go. So when you turn your board, try to make a habit of moving your reference photo as well. And again, we're trying to pick out just a couple of these clumps of fur, a bit like what we did on the head. I don't want too many, and I'm not going to be able to get them all in, but just enough that it gives that feeling that there's some clumped fur. So now that we've ended up sort of filling out a lot of this board in this area, most of our line art isn't going to be visible. So I'm now starting to work things off other things that I've already got in place, other landmarks. So looking at the top of this eye, there's this bit of fur that sort of creeps over. And it means this area here needs to go a bit lighter. And then it helps me judge where this area of brightness then needs to go. There's a little bit of a join. So you also need to be careful that this area here is definitely a brighter area on the reference photo anyway. So we need to definitely make sure that that stands out compared to this area. We don't want all of this to blend in as one tone. So I'm just having to now make this area a bit brighter, so I definitely know where that sort of bright cheek comes to. Now I think we're probably going to have to normally, so with certain pieces you do have to adjust what your plans are. Now normally I would look to get to, like I say, near the end of the piece before I start really coming in and making those highlights brighter. But the problem here is that we've got a lot of tones that are now starting to merge together, and that's what we don't want, because then it just makes it hard to judge other areas and upcoming areas and areas you've already got in place. So I may have to adjust my plan slightly, and I may just have to look at building up the brightness a little bit sooner than I normally would. But looking at the rest of this piece, apart from the ears, most of the body is going to be fairly mid-tone. There's not too many areas. I think there's a bit of an area over the back. I'm quite zoomed in on my reference photo at the minute, so I haven't had a look. But I feel like there's a bit of brightness over the back of this. And then most of the other areas are mainly a mid-tone. So I'm going to carry on working through this area and just start trying to separate these two out a little bit. I'm then probably going to start coming up and around on the ear, but I'm going to speed up quite a lot of this because most of the textures and the techniques I'm doing are very, very similar. So there's not going to be a huge variety in new sort of challenges or new techniques that I'm showing. So to save this video being 4 or 5 hours long, which I'm sure you guys don't want to sit through, I will speed some of it up and then come back to you when we get to some areas where we're going to have to change what we're doing slightly. Right then, so I feel like now that we've adjusted some of the tones and we've got this ear in, it's starting to look a little bit more like a red panda. And I think it's quite helpful to see it come together a bit quicker, like we've just done there. Sometimes when I work slowly, it's a little bit harder to see how everything's going to come together. So when I speed things up like that, I do think it does help. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start working on the other side of this red panda. So I'm just turning my reference photos around so I can see what I'm working with. So we're going to start around here and then it comes up and joins part of the ear. So the technique we're going to be using is the exact same as what you've just seen me use on that side. So we're going to put this base layer down and then slowly start building things up. And you could see how quickly it started to come together using these tattoo needles. So I do think they are a really good tool for this sort of fur. So every fur stroke that I do is not parallel, it's crossing over, it's a bit weavy, a bit wavy, because this red panda is a little bit scruffy in places, so that's what we're trying to capture. And we're trying just to be careful to separate these two areas, because this area is just a little bit darker and I made sure I left a bit of a gap where this was going to sort of become quite a bright area. So I'll show you a little bit of this and then just because it's quite a tedious layering process, I'll speed it up in a moment. We'll see me complete the whole of that, and then we'll probably end up moving then on to the final part where we'll look at completing the rest of this body. So you can see how my strokes, they're not just coming sort of perfectly down from the edge of this face, they're coming up and then they're curving down. And that's just going to help with the form of this cheek. And again, when you're joining these two areas together, this area is quite a dark area. So just when you're on these first initial layers, when it's quite a light layer, like a fine layer, like a not a bright layer, it's sometimes easy to lose that line, especially when it's got a little bit of fur texture in it. So either leave a little bit of a black stripe, or on these first initial layers just go a little bit brighter, and it's just going to make it a little bit easier to see. And don't worry too much about those whiskers just yet, because they're going to go in at the end and they're going to, you know, come across this area. So we're not going to worry too much about that at the minute. And now you've got both sides in, you can just fill out the middle. And just that sort of swooping curved mark, that's going to help. And these, like I say, these initial layers, they can be quite forgiving because we are going to cover up, especially in a bright area, we're going to cover up most of these with subsequent layers. A little bit different if you're working in an area that's a bit darker, like up here, or sort of round here, because there you're only going to put 1 or 2 layers on there. Now there's only a sort of slight subtle tonal change between these two areas. So again, I've left a bit of a line so I know where that transition is. I can build up this area to the brightness that I want, and then what I'll do is I'll fade it across into here because this area is going to be brighter, like we say. So that first layer is down now. So now we're going to come over with that second layer. So for the second layer, like I say, you can either do another layer of this tattoo needle, you can go in with your craft knife already, and then you'll maybe have to put another layer of this down over the top of that. But whatever works for you and whatever style or technique you want to use is fine. We're just trying to get rid of most of that black really, because that's going to give the impression that the fur's either speckled or it's not overly thick, whereas we want this red panda fur to look dense. So a lot of layers are required. Okay, I'm going to start building things up now with my craft knife and just get some of those brighter tones in. And now that we've boosted the brightness and sort of around here and above the eyes, it just makes it a little bit easier for me to judge now this side. Now when you're looking at the reference photo, as this fur comes out over the edge, it's really sort of like crisscrossed. Now just be careful, you don't want to go too wild with this. You can always add more, but like I say, it's quite hard to take those marks away and that layer away. As we come down, it almost flattens out a little bit. you can see how long it actually takes to create this fur. A lot of the time when you just see sort of progress photos on the internet, it's hard to get an idea of how long to spend on certain areas, because you want to get the piece finished and it's hard to sort of resist that urge to rush it. But if you want to build up fur that's like this, where it's quite dense, quite rough in places, you really need to take the time to build up those layers. Because you're never really going to be able to get this impression of depth when you're only doing a couple of layers. It takes a good 3 to 4 layers, and I think that's where a lot of people struggle with fur or don't realize how many layers it actually takes to build up. So that's sort of layer 3 now. So we've still probably got another 2 more layers to go. So I'm going to go back over with this tattoo needle. I'm going to now start blending it up to that line, because I don't need that anymore. I can see now this area is the brightest area. I can see where I am. Taking out some of that extra ink underneath, and then now we're going to go in and, like I say, we're going to use the opposite side of our craft knife, and we're just going to start putting in that extra bright fur. And try and have a look at your reference photo to see where this is going to be. Try not to put it everywhere. You'll probably often see me flicking between the 2 sides of this craft knife, and that's just because I like to have a variation. I like to blend it. So obviously, like I mentioned before, this one side is quite a bright side and the other side's not so much, so I like to have that variation. So now we're going to start moving up and just joining it a little bit more into this upper part of the head. But again, we're not using that brightest side, we're just using the normal side, because I don't want it to be as bright as down here. I want this area to there to be a bit of a noticeable transition. So I'm fairly happy with how that's looking. So what I'll do now, I'm going to speed you up and we're just going to complete the last part of this ear, and that will likely finish off this part of the video, and then in the final part we'll look at creating the rest of the body for this this red panda. But I'll speed this area up and then we'll see how far we get. Right then, so we've now finished majority this side. If you have a look at the reference photo, I've not come across or made the inside of this ear as light as what it is on the reference photo, only because I'm toying with the idea of leaving it a little bit more similar to this one, just so it looks a little bit more balanced. But if I do in the end, sort of, I might decide to just lighten up or brighten up just inside this ear a little bit. But that's mostly the face complete now, so the rest of the part is just going into the body and these legs, and then putting in those whiskers, and then some of the final details. So I'm going to leave this one here for now, and then I'll do the other parts in the next video. So I hope you've enjoyed seeing sort of bring the rest of this head together with the face now. You've sort of seen how I would tackle more sort of wavy, complicated fur up here, and then also more dense, bright looking fur in a few of the other areas. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you again in the next one.